And we are so pleased that you could join us this morning for what is really a critical conversation on a topic always on our minds at MAS. How do we build a better city? A city that is more sustainable, livable, and resilient. We hope that today's conference will inform, empower, and inspire communities and decision makers to reach a consensus about coastal reconstruction. Hurricane Sandy made one thing very clear: we can't continue to do what we've done and expect a different outcome. So, thank you for being here, for helping us chart a new direction for waterfront development in New York City and the region. It's going to be a great morning, and we're honored that two cabinet members are joining us and will bookend the conversation today. Okay, a little bit of brief housekeeping. The conference is live streaming on mas.org and on Twitter. The hashtag is Road2, number 2, Road2 Resilience, with the number 2. And we will be collecting questions for the panelists to answer at the end of their sessions. So you can find a note card. There are note cards at the registration desk, or if you've got a piece of paper, note cards are around here. Write down your questions, wave your filled out note card, and a staffer will come and collect your question. Again, these are for the two panels that will be taking place this morning. I would now like to introduce you to a man I am so fortunate to have as a great friend and co-host, and someone that needs really no introduction, one of our most innovative and great urban thinkers in New York, Shaun. Come on up here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Vin. I could not think of a better partner with whom to do this very important event today. Vin is such a great leader and has transformed municipal art society into the great organization that it is today. Thank you all for your tremendous interest in this, both here in the audience and live streaming. And certainly as we think about how to best recover from this hurricane, our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of this terrible storm. Albert Einstein famously told us that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. It is clear that we must rebuild, but we must do so in a way that is smarter and more sustainable. It is clear that we must protect our region from future storms with measures both large and small and keep an open mind. In putting today's event together, Vin and I are hoping to shed some light on the path forward. In fact, starting today, the Center for Urban Real Estate, CURE, is launching a study examining what worked and what didn't in terms of new high-density construction in our region, with the hope that future construction can be made more resilient. We do know one thing that worked very well during the storm, which was our federal government. The Obama administration has been on top of this storm since its outset, and this morning it is my great pleasure to welcome our Secretary for Housing and Urban Development, my dear friend and colleague, Shaun Donovan, to set the stage for our morning and for our future. On January 26, 2009, Shaun Donovan was sworn in as the 15th United States Secretary for Housing and Urban Development. Recently, President Barack Obama appointed Shaun to head regional efforts on coastal recovery and housing assistance in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. In this capacity, Secretary Donovan will play a critical role in planning for the immediate future of the entire region, as well as coordinating efforts among federal, state, and local governments, which will work under a national disaster recovery framework. Long before his service in Washington, however, Shaun has had deep, long-lasting impact on this region. Under Mayor Bloomberg, Shaun served as the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. There he created and implemented HPD's new housing marketplace plan to build and preserve 165,000 affordable homes in New York City. He previously worked at the Community Preservation Corporation in New York City, a nonprofit lender and developer of affordable housing, and Prudential Mortgage Capital in Newark, New Jersey, where he led its affordable housing portfolio. He's a native New Yorker. He was a visiting scholar. He's also a visiting scholar at NYU, which is an affiliation for which we forgive Shaun. Secretary Donovan believes that America's homes are the foundation for family, safe neighborhoods, good schools, and job creation. In the decade I have known Shaun, he has always had an eye on the future and a solid understanding of the past. In the face of climate change and rising tides, I can think of no better person to lead the regional dialogue on disaster recovery and ensure that we build our new coastlines looking ahead. He will most surely be the voice of sanity. He is here from the government, and he is here to help. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Secretary Shaun Donovan.
Good morning. It's a little bit of a dangerous introduction to Shaun, but hopefully a few years from now we will all look back and feel that way. And I will say to Shaun that one of the things about when a region, when a place goes through a disaster like this, is it does remind us that the public sector has an important role to play, and that is a debate that's obviously actively going on in our country right now. And I want to thank you, Shaun, for all that you've done, but particularly for your leadership as a public servant. We did have the great honor to work together. And the truth is, for those of us who are from New York, who grew up here, it would have been hard to imagine in the dark days of the 1970s that the city might be in the place that it is today. And Shaun has as much to do with that as anybody that I've worked with. So let's give him a round of applause. It is a great pleasure to be here with so many friends that I have worked with over many, many years, and to talk about our plans for rebuilding and revitalizing this city and the entire region in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. This region has been through a great deal over the last month. We've seen our fill of tragedy, but we've also seen a good deal of hope and courage as well. We've also seen extraordinary leadership by many state and local officials. I particularly want to commend the efforts of Mayor Bloomberg, Governors Christie and Cuomo for responding so quickly and thoroughly, as well as for recognizing the need to address both immediate rescue efforts, as well as long-term planning and rebuilding. And I look forward to continuing our work together in the years to come. I also want to recognize and thank once again those many brave people, from emergency first responders to our next-door neighbors, who helped make others' lives more bearable under the extreme circumstances growing out of this storm. Finally, I want to acknowledge the many thousands who have suffered as a result of this storm and in its aftermath, some of whom have experienced profound loss. I particularly want to reassure those who are still dealing with the storm's impact that we will continue to make helping you our first priority. But even as we continue to focus on the critical task of rescuing, repairing, and cleaning up, the immense impact of this storm and the weaknesses it revealed about our region's infrastructure mean that we must look toward the future and a more far-reaching, long-term redevelopment. Our response cannot be business as usual. We need to rebuild the region, and we need to emerge stronger, smarter, and more resilient. It is this path to the future that I will focus on in my remarks today. As we look forward, it is impossible not to be reminded of the recent past and the disaster of Hurricane Katrina. I will never forget sitting in the bullpen at City Hall with Peter Madonia and others, watching on the big screen in the bullpen as the waters flooded the city of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. And quite frankly, I remember the anger I felt as a public servant that so many people on overpasses at the Superdome went without the help that they deserved in their moment of greatest need. And for the families that have been through this storm here in this region, have experienced Sandy, the feelings of loss are very similar. Destroyed homes, loved ones lost, memories of places that will never quite be the same. But in contemplating this comparison, I'm also struck by how in just a few years, we've made great strides in responding to this kind of catastrophic event. Most importantly, we learned a great deal about storm preparation and response from the devastation of Katrina. It's the reason we had vast resources ahead of Sandy's, here in the region ahead of Sandy's landfall. And we responded to the enormity of the devastation with a massive, multi-agency, multi-state coordinated response. Within a week after Sandy hit, we had almost 15,000 federal responders on the ground from FEMA, the National Guard, and the Army Corps of Engineers, and many, many other agencies, including mine. We also had tens of thousands of utility workers from across the nation that came here. And in fact, I remember on an early Saturday morning, the first Saturday after the storm, sitting with the president and the cabinet, and Leon Panetta handed him a picture of a utility truck driving off a military plane. That truck had been brought from California with its workers as part of this enormous response to get power back and to get this region moving again as quickly as possible. Today, just about 4 weeks after the storm, FEMA has already provided more than $1.1 billion in assistance to hundreds of thousands of families across the region. To be clear, our response to this storm was not perfect, but we will continue to learn and to improve our disaster response planning. I will also never forget one of the very first trips that I took as HUD Secretary was with Janet Napolitano to the Gulf Coast. And what I saw 3.5 years after the storm was many neighborhoods that looked as if the storm had come just days or weeks before. Since that first visit, I've returned to the region more than a dozen times, and I've seen substantial progress, and I particularly want to recognize Janet Napolitano and the magnificent work of Craig Fugate, the FEMA administrator. Just one example. When Janet and I traveled there for the first time in early 2009, 3.5 years later, not a single family from public housing had been able to move into the complexes that had been devastated there after the storm. Today, not only are families back in every one of those complexes, but there is more affordable housing in New Orleans than there was before Katrina hit. Katrina taught us that for too long, governments viewed their roles as more focused on emergency response and neglected our important role in long-term recovery. For catastrophic disasters like this one, we need to address from the federal role on down both short-term response and long-term recovery and redevelopment at the same time. There are 4 little critical lessons that should serve as a guide. First, long-term recovery and redevelopment efforts must start immediately following a disaster. To ensure this happens, from the very beginning, a team that is focused on recovery and rebuilding must be in place. Second, while the federal government has a key leadership role to play in recovery, one that includes providing vital funding and technical assistance, as well as cutting red tape, it is state and local governments that must provide the vision for local communities. And most importantly, that vision must be owned by the community. Third, the recovery effort must be driven by resilience and rebuilding smart, rather than simply recreating what was already there. At the center of these efforts must be the changing needs of the community, the changing impact on the environment, and a plan for economic growth. Finally, we must integrate these forward-looking recovery efforts with the challenges that communities faced even before a disaster. More complete issues relating to communities that have traditionally been too often left behind in the wake of disasters. So post-Katrina, one thing was abundantly clear. We could not let this happen again, which is why in September 2009, President Obama charged me and Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano to incorporate the 4 lessons I laid out into a new approach to disaster-related recovery and rebuilding challenges from a national perspective. We created a long-term disaster working group composed of more than 20 federal agencies and consulted closely with state and local governments, as well as experts and stakeholders. Out of this grew the National Disaster Recovery Framework, which after extensive public comment was published in its final version in 2011. The NDRF provides a flexible structure that enables disaster recovery managers to operate in a unified and collaborative manner, putting in place that critical team to address long-term recovery. In fact, as I speak today, there are more than 150 federal workers in New York and New Jersey that are focused entirely on the long-term recovery of this region. And I want to congratulate New York City and the states of New Jersey and New York for standing up their own efforts, focused in a very short time on this longer-term recovery. Our team's focus, and the work we'll be doing with those teams at the city and state level, is on how best to restore, redevelop, and revitalize the 6 areas most critical to recovery and redevelopment of a community: housing, infrastructure systems, small business and local industry, health systems and social services, natural and cultural resources, and community planning and capacity building. While the majority of disasters affect a single geographic region, and that certainly influenced the design of the NDRF, the structure was created to be adaptable to regional response and recovery. That's why we've effectively used the NDRF to respond to the multi-state drought this past summer, both immediately and with a comprehensive plan to address longer-term concerns. Sandy will be one of the most devastating and costly natural disasters in our nation's history. The President recognized that it required not simply the NDRF, but an additional focus that would address the enormous range of regional issues and a larger cabinet-level coordinating role across federal agencies and with state and local governments. That's why last Friday, the President signed an executive order creating the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and appointed me to be the chair. I'm honored the President chose me to lead this effort. As someone with strong personal connections and deep roots in this region, he knew that this wasn't just a recovery effort to me. It was personal. And in my work at the local level, I've developed important relationships with leaders across the region. People with strong personalities, big ideas, and broad visions. People who have the expertise and knowledge necessary to make this recovery one that's strong, smart, and resilient. And the President understands that you all are critical to ensuring that the entire region makes a vibrant recovery. He also understands that I speak the language of all of you shy and retiring New Yorkers and New Jerseyans. Finally, I think the President recognized that I lead an agency that has long played a critical role in responding to the needs of communities as they revitalize and prepare for the future. It is, after all, the UD in HUD. We apply the critical principles of recovery I mentioned earlier every day in our regular efforts to revitalize and rebuild communities. I hope that we've taken HUD from a place of the urban renewal days, where we looked at every troubled community as a problem to be solved, a tabula rasa to be cleaned away and to start again, to a place where we once again have a strong federal role as a partner, but we see communities as places with assets. We ask them what their vision is for what a community should be, and work to help build toward that vision. We also have incorporated sustainability deeply into many of our efforts, creating for the first time an Office of Sustainable Housing and Communities, and providing regional and local planning dollars that cover at this point about 1/3 of the US's population. And finally, I hope that we've brought a comprehensive view of what it takes communities to revitalize, not just the bricks and mortar, but all of the pieces that are necessary to make the complex ecosystem of neighborhoods work and thrive. In short, our work at HUD has focused on revitalization without falling into the trap that too often we have fallen into in the past. But no matter how good HUD may be at these jobs, a recovery of this complexity and scale is going to require all the expertise and resources the federal government has to offer. We're going to need to address many different needs of these communities at once, from housing to transportation to education to healthcare, and the list goes on. And this task force gives us, right from the start, the ability to respond on all those fronts. With the expertise of virtually the entire cabinet represented, we're prepared to make the local and state vision of this recovery a reality. The task force will have 5 major responsibilities. First, and most importantly, it will coordinate with all stakeholders to deliver cohesive rebuilding strategies, creating a comprehensive regional plan within 6 months. We'll share the best practices of recovering communities, creating a vision for long-term rebuilding by state and local stakeholders, a vision that will be supported by more thoughtful planning and a focus on resilience and sustainability. Second, we'll reduce regulatory burdens and cut red tape. You know the Hippocratic Oath. Job one, first, do no harm. Third, and there will be thousands of state and local decisions that need to be made to get this recovery right. The federal government can't stand in the way of those important decisions. Third, we will manage the flow of federal recovery funds and make sure that the resources the federal government provides are aligned with state and local priorities. Fourth, we'll monitor the progress of this funding and strengthen accountability measures around that funding. One of the things I've learned over these 4 years working on disasters around this nation is that there is no time in the American public's life when they are more open to the need for the help of the government. They know that in a disaster, that is when we need to make sure that we come together collectively and that our public sector provides help. But I've also seen that there is no time when they are more vulnerable to despair and disillusionment about the federal government's role, or any government's role, if we fail. And so it's incumbent on me and all of my colleagues at the federal level to make sure that this investment is wise, carefully done, and that we do not waste these precious resources. Finally, more than a checkbook, we are also, I hope, a resource, given the experience that we've had, frankly, too often this experience the last few years, of seeing what is best and what works and what doesn't work in communities and regions across the country in responding to disasters. We can offer technical assistance and tools, providing critical support as those on the ground realize their vision for redevelopment and revitalization. Ultimately, this task force is not and cannot be simply federal oversight or mandate. It must provide leadership and connections that actively support these local visions. Rebuilding must be a community-driven effort with a community-based vision at its heart, but supporting that vision through financial means is a key part of the federal role, one that has always been provided for communities experiencing disaster. And so last Friday, the President delivered to Congress a request for $60 billion in supplemental assistance to aid in storm recovery. The request includes funds for transportation, veterans at risk, support for the Small Business Administration and its efforts to help local businesses harmed by the storm, and a range of other critical priorities. Central to these other priorities, the President included $17 billion in community development block grant funding, the single largest request ever. This is especially important because CDBG funds offer the greatest flexibility and effectiveness in responding to disasters. It is a recognition of this region's great and varied needs. The coordinated planning process created by the NDRF and amplified by the task force, as well as key changes, legislative changes in CDBG funding that build on our lessons from Katrina, will ensure that this money is used efficiently and effectively and in a timely fashion. And speaking of timely, it is absolutely critical that we all work to ensure Congress passes this help as quickly as possible, literally before this session of Congress is out at the end of the month. Why is that? Because there are hundreds of thousands of people, families, businesses, who literally cannot get on with planning their lives and their futures until Congress acts. The money that goes to these communities can't simply be a blank check to rebuild exactly as before. In many places we can and will rebuild, but not without additional measures to ensure that the investments we're making in these communities are protected from future disasters. Communities need to use innovative approaches in planning to better protect themselves, limit the impact of future disasters, and address underlying community needs. The federal government must support those efforts. After Katrina, our administration offered New Orleans greater flexibility in rebuilding. It allowed the city to relocate rather than rebuild schools to address changes in the population. Literally, the prior process had been if there was a school on this site, it needed to be rebuilt there and basically to the same size and specifications as what was there before. Given the enormous demographic and other changes that we see in any metropolitan area over the years, we can't simply require rebuilding or just provide funding for what was there before. This type of more thoughtful planning process that the NDRF advocates ensures that we ask ourselves, can we rebuild what was here before? And more importantly, should we? These questions are not just complicated from a planning or construction point of view. They cut to the heart of how we define our communities and what gives us a sense of place. But mitigation isn't just sensible. It's actually enormously cost-effective as well. The Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council examined 10 years of FEMA mitigation grants, and the data found that government mitigation efforts offer a $4 return for every dollar of investment that we make by preventing future damage. And we've seen them work across the nation. Efforts we took in response to a number of hurricanes in the Gulf Coast have demonstrated significant success in protecting homes. Those that have been raised, built with stronger roofs and other mitigation measures, went undamaged, while homes in the same communities that did not have mitigation were severely damaged or destroyed. Along the Jersey Shore, towns that invested in beach replenishment and larger dunes suffered considerably less damage than their neighbors. We need to harness this momentum to address weaknesses we've known about for years. Protecting the beaches and marshes on our barrier islands, modernizing utilities in flood-prone areas. We have to recognize that homes that wash away and substations located in flood zones must become a thing of the past. Cities and states increasingly are recognizing the value of mitigation, and there is stiff competition for funding when it's available. At HUD, for instance, for the first time ever, we established a disaster relief enhancement fund of over $300 million in matching funding for mitigation projects undertaken by states with a disaster CDBG funding. Demand exceeded the available funding by about 3 to 1. To anyone who doubts that mitigation is necessary or still believes that it's too expensive, I have one question. What happens next time? As often as we label Sandy a hurricane, it was in fact a tropical storm combined with an exceptionally high tide when it hit these shores. Yet as we know, the damage was tremendous and could have been far worse. And it won't be the last one. As a number of our region's leaders have said, it seems like these days, the 100-year storms are coming every few years. In rebuilding our communities, we must embrace a vision that is stronger and more economically competitive, one that encourages greater community involvement and investment. The recovery must address the needs of the entire region, one of the most important economic powerhouses in the world. If we get this recovery right, we will emerge more economically competitive than we were before Sandy overran the Battery walls just a few feet from here. But we must also focus on those individual places that are too often left behind. Whether it's hardworking middle-class families in Staten Island or lower-income families in the Rockaways that are managing to make ends meet and trying to get into the middle class. We would be negligent if we overlooked those existing conditions that the storm has thrown into sharper relief. President Obama understands this and is why he made a central question of this campaign, whether this country will continue to be able to provide a strong middle class and a ladder into that middle class. In this economic fight we have internationally these days, we simply cannot afford to leave anyone behind. And a key participant in this recovery must be the private sector, which continues to be a generous, willing, and able partner in our recovery efforts. This kind of investment makes economic sense for them and for the community, and we're going to engage them further. Later today, for instance, I'll be taking part in an announcement by the New York Teachers Retirement System, a pension fund for many of our public workers, which is making a significant investment in the city's infrastructure targeted specifically to Hurricane Sandy recovery efforts. This kind of effort is inspiring, and our task force will be looking for ways to replicate this timely and forward-thinking investment. This kind of joint public-private partnership is important for the recovery, but it's also important for something else. In this country today, we too often have shrill debates about big government versus small government, about the public sector versus the private sector. The truth, as we know in New York and in this region, is that the smartest government isn't about those tired polarities. It's about bringing together sectors, each of us doing what we do best, but being humble and understanding that we must have partnerships to achieve a full recovery. In summary, new challenges and our changing landscape and the reality it presents for our safety require new solutions. This region can lead the way as a 21st century model for this country. I know that each and every one of you in the audience today is already engaged in helping us get there. We must address not only recent damage, but challenges facing our communities that are the result of long-term neglect to infrastructure and economic disinvestment. We must focus not simply on what our communities will look like and how they will be better in the next few years, but in the next few generations. The best efforts in redevelopment have been achieved with a civic planning and commitment that goes not simply to rebuilding after a storm or other disaster, but making neglected investments in all of our communities. This is not just, though, about repairing Staten Island or the Rockaways or the Jersey Shore or the Long Island Shore, although each of these is absolutely critical to the recovery. The recovery will fall short if we do only that. The plan we create must put us firmly on the path to a more sustainable future. The future that emerges out of these efforts is one that must include the entire region, making it the most economically competitive in the world. The redevelopment that we design together must lift up every community touched by the storm. Because as Americans, we don't leave individual communities to pick up the pieces after a disaster. We lift them up as one nation. Thank you.
Secretary Donovan, thank you so much. That was an extraordinary speech, and what we really heard in that speech was, I think, well, at least what I heard, were two things. One, a sense of vision, and that we need to have a sense of vision for the future. And second, a sense of partnership, that he's not just talking about a strong federal role, but a federal partner. And what we do at the local level in terms of local government, the private sector, local communities, is just as critical in order to make this recovery as great as it possibly can be for all those who are impacted. So we're going to try to help unpack that now with the remainder of the morning. And there are three parts to this before we hear from Secretary Salazar. There will be two panels, what we call a technical panel that really discusses, what are the potential technical solutions that we see in terms of recovery and rebuilding. Then we will hear from a representative from the Dutch government in terms of best practices from the Netherlands, where, of course, there is a tremendous concern about these issues. And then we will have a panel about management and governance. How do we fund? How do we govern through our way through this next period and this crisis that has just passed? I believe Vince Polo talked about that. We're going to have questions, question cards that people will be submitting, and we'll be answering them through the cards. So next, I'm going to introduce our technical panel, starting with my colleague from Columbia University, Kate Orff. Kate is a registered landscape architect and the founder of Scape, a design studio based in Lower Manhattan. She is also an assistant professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Kate was named a USA Artist Fellow in 2012. After graduating from the University of Virginia with distinction, Kate earned a Master of Landscape Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Kate was a leading participant in the Museum of Modern Art's 2012 exhibition, Rising Currents. Eugenie Birch. Jeannie is Lawrence S.C. Nussdorf Chair of Urban Research and Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She has been president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, president of Society of American City and Regional Planning History, and co-editor, Journal of the American Planning Association. Her civic commitments include serving as the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Municipal Arts Society of New York, Scenic Hudson, and the International Downtown Association. She has co-chaired United Nations Habitat's World Urban Campaign. In the early 1990s, she was a member of the City Planning Commission in New York City, and in 2002 served on the jury to select the designers for the World Trade Center site. Our moderator, Justin Davidson, is the architectural and classical music critic in New York Magazine since 2007, writing about a broad range of urban, civic, and design issues. Before that, he spent 12 years as classical music critic at Newsday, where he also wrote about architecture and was a regular commentator on cultural issues. Justin won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2002. Paul Farmer, FAICP, is Chief Executive Officer of the American Planning Association and its professional institute, the American Institute of Certified Planners. He previously served in senior management positions as planning director in Minneapolis and the department and deputy planning director in Pittsburgh. He has consulted throughout the world and has taught, written, and lectured extensively. He received both his BArch and BA degrees from Rice University and his MRP degree in city and regional planning from Cornell University. And finally, Dale Morris is senior economist at the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Washington, D.C., providing economic and political analyses of U.S. macroeconomic, fiscal, and monetary policy, as well as U.S. federal budget, tax, and appropriations developments. Morris directs the Dutch government's water management network in Louisiana, Florida, and California, where the focus is on a broad array of sustainability topics, including flood protection, flood risk mitigation, coastal restoration, water supply and conveyance, ecosystem resiliency, climate change adaptation, and landscape design for risk reduction. He is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Virginia. If I could please invite the panel to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As our panel gets settled, I'll just say thank you to Secretary Donovan for those inspiring remarks. And what I'm going to talk about today, I've prepared quite a few slides. I'm going to go through them quite quickly, but slides that I hope can provoke a dialogue and discussion about the various ways of thinking about technical aspects of resiliency. So, and the thought is that we have a sort of emerged kind of idea of resilient eco-infrastructure. So this is an image of a project on the East River in Brooklyn, and what I think it talks to is this brave new world that we have now encountered. And it's actually an image of the Austin Nichols Warehouse by Cass Gilbert, which was built in the early 1900s, which is half on slab and half on piles. And so I think we can look to techniques both new and old for as we move into this future post-Sandy world. But I think you can see these kind of realms that we'll need to be thinking about, not only on the land-based side, which is building technologies and techniques, zoning opportunities, but inside in the water side, and also kind of thinking about edges. And what's missing in this picture is the idea of an urban edge and a resilient waterfront. So this is a slide of the New York Bight, which you can see in the geographical signature of this image. It's kind of two funneling land masses that really are pushing sort of water and into the New York Harbor. And you can see the sort of geographical signature also of these 2 points, Sandy Hook and Breezy Point, part of Gateway National Park, and under federal jurisdiction, and the vulnerability of both the outer and the inner harbor of New York City. And here we are with a zoom into that land of Breezy Point and Sandy Hook. and one can imagine and see in the next slide what that landmass was really before settlement. This is an image of the sort of historic ecology of the region, where you can see we had a Jamaica Bay landscape that had a thick protective dune, rich and abundant salt marsh grasses that really are really a parable of an ecological form of resilience that form layers and layers of resilience and protection. You also see the sort of mouth of the harbor as sort of a shallow zone, and one can imagine that being also incredibly a powerful tool in terms of a protected inner realm of the New York Harbor. This is a map from the New York Times showing the extensive flooding in blue, and which I think is quite shocking and which we all have probably seen. But in that it parallels very closely the extents of the sort of historic wetland area that we have filled and settled. Once, you know, in the age of the pre-settlement, this was, or during the early settlement of New York, these were really camps or temporary settlements on our barrier islands, and now they've become more permanent. So we're talking today about storm surge, sea level rise. I would add water quality to that equation, and I think I would also add carbon, and I think recalibrating our settlement patterns relative to carbon emissions is probably beyond the scope of this panel, but I do think that that is the elephant in the room, and that collectively, beyond resilience, we need to think about planning more effectively for a low carbon footprint. So these are two images that I think maybe will help set the table for this discussion, at least relative to technologies. On the left, you see a slide for protective scenario with barriers, this being somewhat like a 15-mile barrier connecting those 2 points on the geography I just mentioned, with critical other barriers located around the harbor's edge. Often called sort of the big infrastructure approach, if you will. And on the right, the scenarios that were explored in the Museum of Modern Art Rising Current show, which you maybe call, you know, put in the category of being soft infrastructure. And I think there are probably, any reasonable person would see the limitations of both practices. On the left, you can imagine that of course, it would protect the New York Harbor, and those of us inside the barrier would kind of continue on and not even notice the effects of this storm. But I think it also calls into question this sort of notion of an enclaved, global warming, kind of global city, and relative to you know, those of us who have earned our great wealth by burning carbon have somehow left on the outside those who haven't. And on the right, I think you can see the best of intentions, but that is potentially not very effective in some situations. So what I want to address and put forward is this notion of merging the idea of natural resources and infrastructure. This is a plan by the Army Corps of Engineers and the HEP program that shows potential comprehensive restoration sites that include shallow zones, shoals, oyster reef creation, and coastal wetland creation. So what I think could be very interesting to put forward is this notion of a hybrid eco-infrastructure in which hard barriers and soft ecological habitat creation systems could begin to work in tandem. And here you can see a couple of how those things might work, where you have a barrier option, you have dune replenishment, salt marsh cultivation, island and reef building, shoreline modifications and oyster reefs and so on, that would be coordinated and in a response to our region's new context. This is an image of an oyster reef based a view of Alabama, and it is a built oyster reef, but you can actually see its effects of calming and attenuating storm waves. And so now I'm just going to talk about my MoMA project, which was located here near Governor's Island and was really focused on this blue triangular area, which is called the Bay Ridge Flats. And Oystertecture was really a community-inspired vision that integrated reef building and storm surge infrastructure with community-based oyster gardening programs. This is a view of that same region in 1776, Governor's Island. You can see it was actually quite an intelligent way of thinking about the settlement pattern, where a settlement was happening on the high ridgeline, and you have a series of barrier reefs, islands, and shoals protecting that upland settlement. And we called our project sort of Back to the Future, which is, of course, a new, completely fabricated ecological infrastructure, but one that was inspired and informed by the past. So we basically rethought the idea of the oyster life cycle relative to an urban design strategy, growing oysters in the refurbished post-Superfund canal and seeding them out on the reef, repurposing common aquitecture techniques, and in the process cleaning the water, slowing down the water, and creating a kind of a new habitat and where inland communities could be in closer contact with that water. An image of how the reef works, and it was really a combination of really low-tech things of rock piles and sediment piles and planting and a sort of a net that would initially host oyster and mussel habitat. And here's a view of that. And a view of how moving through the cross-section, I think we can imagine this cross-section more broadly in the harbor of New York, is moving from more turbulent waters to cleaner and slower water. And a view of the public reef. And I think a key part of this discussion is that as we move forward with new technologies and refocusing our emphasis on the waterfront and out in the waters, that public space and design is a key part. A view of the new Gowanus edges as its existing condition and as sort of a proposed, more resilient edge. Also, I've been working at Columbia exploring with students other scenarios and working with modeling large-scale digital models of the harbor to look at different scenarios of reef building and what they might or might not protect and what their effects would be on the ecology. This was a scenario that looked at how to integrate Governor's Island with a protective reef around Lower Manhattan. And Phil Orton's model actually showed some really significant and positive effects of that eco-infrastructure. So I'll close there and hand the clicker over to Jeannie.
Thank you very much, Kate. And that was a wonderful vision and a wonderful talk by Shaun, who emphasized the importance for creating the vision and the importance of the locality. My argument today here is that we are there. We have the tools. They're in place, and we need to use them. If we just take a survey of what we've done in the past 10 or 15 years, we have the Plan YC. And in the Plan YC, of course, we have a lot of other plans that have come forward, particularly our Stormwater Protection Plan, the Vision 2020, and many other things. We have, of course, our Waterfront Revitalization Program, which is required by the federal government, and every 10 years we put forward our Capital Strategy Program, which is built on the community boards who put forth their statement of needs. It goes through the budgeting process for an annual capital budget and ultimately ends up in this 10-year program. So we are resilient in terms of the technical infrastructure and documents and information that we have to do these kinds of things. And I would urge us to take account of that. We also have huge tools at hand. We have our zoning ordinance, we have environmental impact statements, we have the statement of needs, as I've mentioned, we have the FEMA maps that come out of the natural hazard study, the SPOSH maps, the 100-year floodplains, and so forth. We have it all here. But what don't we have? And we also have many, many other resources. We have tons of resources in the private sector, the non-profit sector, and so forth. Just look at this list. But what don't we have? We don't have an integrated information system. We don't have a coordinating agency that is taking all of this material and putting it together into this vision that we need so that we can move forward in a resilient manner. So my plea to all of us today is to come up with and advocate for a solution that is going to put the leadership in the right place. I would suggest it might be in the Office of the Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, in the Mayor's office, which would be a natural thing that could coordinate the other agencies. Could also work with the new state commissions that Governor Cuomo has just appointed, and of course could be the lead agency in dealing with FEMA and all of the work of the task force that Shaun Donovan explained today. So I'm just going to leave you with this plea, this thought that we have it, we're resilient, we're thick with social and intellectual capital in this area. We just have to focus it and move forward to do what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here to share some thoughts with you today. APA is an educational organization, a membership association of about 40,000 members in 90 countries. And so we are primarily based in this country, but we have members throughout the world, and we collaborate throughout the world. And we've done that with the Dutch, certainly following Katrina and Rita in New Orleans. We established a few years ago a hazard research center to provide some focus for a lot of our educational work. We are an educational organization. If you go to the website, planning.org, you'll find a lot of the resources there. We've done contract work with FEMA and HUD and Department of State and NOAA and a variety of other federal agencies, looking at a broad range of situations around the country, whether it's wildfires, whether it's floods, whether it's landslides, volcanoes, whatever it may be, looking at overall the issues of risk and risk management. And one of the things that I would share is that I think that we can look at disaster events in several different categories. There are what I would call more or less routine events. The state of Florida has hurricanes almost every year. And we've gotten to be pretty good at dealing with the issues of hurricanes, both in terms of building codes and investment, as well as recovery. We have more episodic events, and I would put earthquakes in California in this category. They don't happen every year, but they do happen with some frequency. We also have these rare events. Katrina was the worst natural disaster ever to hit the U.S. A lot of that was man-made. It wasn't just natural. And of course, Sandy has affected an area with a population the size of the United Kingdom. Katrina devastated an area of the country that was the geographic size of the United Kingdom. But what happens with climate disruption, climate change, global warming, whatever we want to call it, whatever we're allowed to call it in political debates? What happens when climate change starts affecting these categories? I think it's fair to say we're going to see more events in all of these categories. But we're also going to see events that perhaps move from one category to another category. What happens if these rare events start occurring with such frequency that they become episodic events? And the episodic events start becoming events that are perhaps annual events. We also have some events that are episodic, like earthquakes, that could become one of the rare events. Should an earthquake strike an area around San Francisco where many levees that were not built by the Army Corps of Engineers, were not built to any standards, those levees are astride known fault lines, and they protect areas, much of which is below sea level. And geologists tell us that if that occurrence happens, those levees will fail. 100% predictable, they will fail. They will cause a loss of property and a loss of life that will dwarf that of Katrina. So that is one of the issues that the West Coast is facing. Here, certainly with Sandy, we saw a confluence of a variety of natural occurrences, from the historic low pressure system to the high tide to the astronomical high tide, that all brought about this event with this extraordinary surge of some 14 to 15 feet, as I understand. So what are some of the tools that we might want to look at? Jeannie has laid out the tools that we have, a very good list of tools, and many of them quite current, quite recent. But let me suggest that one of the things that we've learned in our collaboration with the Dutch is that we need to really challenge ourselves to be ready to rethink our paradigms. In this country still, wherever water falls, we try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. In the Netherlands now, they try to keep water in place for as long as possible. They understand that water itself is not the problem, it's the pooling of water, it's the rushing of water that does the damage. So they are actively engaged day to day in water management. It's not just a defense system, it's a management system. But also their defense system is multiple defenses. They don't rely just on a series of dikes or levees. Again, they found that there is some probability of failure of any one of those. And so multiple defenses, and I think Kate was suggesting that in terms of the work that she's done and she shared with us today. Unlike the US, where in 1927, for example, we started damming the Mississippi River, leading to many of the problems that they face now in the Gulf. In the Netherlands, they look at room for the river. And so how might that paradigm shift address issues, not just perhaps in Manhattan, but when you look out at what's going on in New Jersey or the Rockaways. The other thing we learned from the Dutch is that they do not plan unless they also provide an investment strategy that is tied to that plan. They also don't invest without having had a plan. You'll be hearing Jos talk about that later here this morning. Perhaps that's a return to the old style of planning in this country. We used to actually embed capital improvement programs in our plans. And as a country, we've gotten away from that. I think with climate change, it's time to take another look at that. So maybe that's not a paradigm shift as much as a return to an successful paradigm. I'd like to also suggest that we have leadership that can share what they learned. Senator Mary Landrieu is absolutely an outstanding leader in the US Senate. Spent a lot of time herself learning about the Dutch examples, and I know she was here just in this last week with your local elected officials sharing some of her exercises. At a time when a disaster occurs, emotions are raw, and we need to respect that. At the same time, it does bring up the opportunity to have certain conversations in terms of placement of development, as just one example. But as professionals, I think we also all need to get smarter, and we do need to do it quickly, both individuals as well as our professional organizations. And we need to do it long term. We can't just do it when it's a fad. There was a great deal of attention on New Orleans. Lots of institutions rushed in. Most of them are gone. They aren't to be seen again until the next fad comes along. And I think we need to realize that these aren't fads. And in fact, these aren't just such rare events that we can kind of ignore them. We do need to get on with this task. And I'm pleased to say that our two chapters here in New Jersey and New York, led by Chuck Latini in New Jersey and James Rouse here in New York, are actively working to make sure that as an institution in a sense, they are kind of in this for the long haul. And I think over the long haul and addressing these huge issues for our country and our communities. Thank you.